I'd like to spend the little time we have today just introducing you to the theme of the book, which is really the theme that I've spent my life on as a professional scientist, and tell you the story that led to this work and give you little tidbits as we go along. Probably the most important characteristic of emotion when we interact in our daily lives with those around us, the characteristic that is so salient is that people differ in how they respond to life's slings and arrows. Some people in response to adversity decompensate rapidly and have a very difficult time recovering. Other people in response to the same kind of adversity are quite resilient and they're able to overcome these obstacles with great facility. That question has really been the question that has motivated my entire career. The book is a summary of 35 years of research that delineates different characteristics of the brain and behavior that impact how and why a person may respond differently to emotional challenges that he or she might confront. And that's the first part of the book. The second part of the book is about how we can change these emotional styles if they're not suiting us for whatever reason. And this is where the work that I've done in the area that I call contemplative neuroscience has been particularly important, because strategies that we can derive from the contemplative traditions could be useful in helping us to change brain circuits that underlie these emotional styles, and in turn to change the patterns of emotional responding themselves. So I will introduce you to those topics today, and I'll end with some of our very recent work on the application of some of these strategies to very, very young children, where we have the opportunity to cultivate positive habits of mind in preschool children who are still in a very formative period of their development. So with that as an introduction, and I don't know if you need me to stay still. Okay, I can wander, good. I already mentioned that individual differences, the idea that one person may respond to life slings and arrows very differently than another, is such a central feature of emotion. It is really the key to understanding temperament and personality. It's the key to understanding why some people are vulnerable to psychopathology compared to others. It also plays a very important role in modulating what we call peripheral biology that may be important for health and illness. Peripheral biology is biology below the neck that may be important for physical illness. And the idea that emotions are connected to physical illness is something that is beginning to be understood in terms of very detailed mechanisms now that involve how the brain interacts with the immune system, with the endocrine system, and with the autonomic nervous system. And there are parts of this book that deal with that. I'm not going to address that today. Now, in my book, I describe 6 emotional styles. These are not emotional styles that are obvious. They don't correspond to personality types. They are all directly based upon hard-nosed neuroscientific evidence, and they come directly from the neuroscience literature. And I don't have time to talk about each of them, but I'll describe each of them for you. The first one is resilience, and it refers to the rapidity with which a person recovers from adversity. How fast or slow are you to recover from adversity? The second we call outlook, and outlook refers to the extent to which, or the skill that you have in showing persistent positive emotion. The third style is called social intuition, and it refers to the facility you have at decoding nonverbal social cues of emotion. The fourth is self-awareness, and it refers to differences among people in their perception of their own bodily cues that are important for emotion. The fifth is context, and that refers to the extent to which you take into account your context in modulating your emotional responses. How you behave with your boss could and should be different than how you behave with your spouse or with your offspring. So being able to modulate your emotional responses in a context-sensitive way is another individual difference. And finally, attention, which normally isn't thought about in relation to emotion, but it's critically important, and it refers to how focused or scattered you are, which turns out to play an enormously important role in aspects of emotion. So I'm going to talk in more detail about a few of these and also show you some evidence for the plasticity of these emotional styles and how certain contemplative practices can actually alter these styles and their brain bases. But first, a little bit about the resilient style. This is a hypothetical graph with two individuals that are depicted. And the way I've drawn this graph is that person A, the person with the squares, is showing a slower recovery compared to person B in response to a hypothetical adverse event. So imagine a stressful event occurs, and these are how two people respond, and person B is showing a more rapid recovery compared to person A. They both show the same amplitude of response, but they differ in how rapidly they recover. Now, I'm not going to talk in a lot of detail about the neuroscientific basis of this, but we can interrogate the temporal dynamics of brain activity using functional MRI as well as other techniques, and actually look at the rapidity with which neural signals return back to baseline. It turns out that these are stable over time, and they predict very interesting characteristics of behavior and of biology. And I'll just give you one example. So we can present images like this of human suffering and look at how people regulate their emotions in response to these kinds of pictures. And this is a study that was done by Heather Uri in my lab a few years ago. And what it shows is that when people are using cognitive strategies to regulate their emotions, they show systematic changes in the amygdala. If you look at the blue bars on this figure, that is a period when individuals are instructed to upregulate their negative emotion in response to images of this kind. The yellow bars are the amygdala signal when people are instructed to use cognitive strategies to downregulate their negative emotions. And the maroon bars are a control condition where they're not asked to regulate at all. Now, what's this got to do with individual differences? Well, it turns out we asked the question, people show this pattern on average, but do those who show this pattern more extremely, who are able to regulate the activity in their amygdala, what's going on in other parts of their brain that may be associated with this skill at regulation? And it turns out that when you search the entire brain volume for where in the brain there are signals related to that regulation ability, what you see is an area in the prefrontal cortex that emerges. And this is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and this area emerges as a key area that is involved in this regulatory skill. Now, if we ask whether individuals who are good at modulating the activity in the amygdala, what's going on with the prefrontal cortex? What you see is that those individuals who are showing a big signal in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex when they're downregulating their negative emotion are the ones who are showing a small signal in the amygdala. This scatter plot is showing that inverse relation between activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and activity in the amygdala. So what this means is that this is a circuit which likely plays a very important role in resilience. It likely plays a very important role in modulating the activity of the amygdala in response to this experimental provocation, which is this negative image. But then we asked, okay, this is all well and good, but is this related to regulatory processes that occur in real life outside the laboratory? And what we did is we sampled these individuals for 7 consecutive days, and we obtained saliva samples from which we assayed the hormone cortisol, which is important in stress neurobiology. And what you see here is the average diurnal curve of cortisol. And for those of you who know about this system, this is a very typical average curve where people show high levels of cortisol in the morning, and cortisol goes down progressively through the rest of the day. This has been found thousands of times before. This is the normative diurnal variation. However, one of the things that you rarely see in published scientific articles is the dirty laundry which makes up our mean effects. So I want to now show you what each individual actually looks like, and this is what they look like. So each colored line there is a different participant in this study, and you can see that there's a lot of variation. Some individuals have a much flatter profile than other individuals. Why are we interested in this? Well, it turns out that people who have a flat cortisol profile across the day have a larger waist circumference. They perform more poorly on measures of explicit memory. They show lower perceived social support, and they report higher levels of stress. That's from a recent study done by one of my colleagues. There are many other studies which have found similar effects. So that's one of the key reasons we're interested in this diurnal variation in cortisol. So we asked the question whether the signals that we can measure in the brain that we think have something to do with resilience, are they related to this important variation in this hormonal index over the course of the day? And again, without going into lots of detail, the evidence shows that there are indeed striking associations, so that the people who are the good emotion regulators, we would say these are the resilient people who show high levels of ventromedial prefrontal activation and low levels of amygdala activation, are the ones who are able to have a very steep cortisol profile where they're showing high levels of cortisol in the morning that go down progressively toward the end of the day. And the most important period is at the end of the day, just before bed. If cortisol is high when you go to sleep, it can have a deleterious impact on certain aspects of restorative function during sleep, and may be associated with a whole cascade of deleterious consequences, particularly when it accumulates over time. So one of the things I have in the book, which I'm actually, in the interest of time, going to skip here, are these little questionnaires, and I'm very skeptical of self-report measures myself, but we decided to actually construct these questionnaires for the purpose of this book, and we'll see if they really have validity, but you can just think about this in your own experience. It just gives you a taste for the kinds of domains we think this dimension is tapping. So a question like, if another driver sneaks into a parking space I've been patiently waiting for, I am likely to shake it off easily rather than fume about it for a long time. True or false? When I've experienced profound grief, such as the death of someone close to me, it has proven so debilitating so as to interfere with my ability to function for many months. If I make a mistake at work and get reprimanded for it, I can shrug it off and take it as a learning experience. If I'm at a new restaurant and order the most expensive thing on the menu and find out that it's awful, it ruins my whole evening. Those are the kinds of real-life situations which this dimension may be relevant to. So a little bit about the outlook style, which has to do with the maintenance of positive emotion over time. And this is a style that we have uncovered mostly through our research, well, at least initially through our research with depression, more recently with research in other kinds of samples. And I'll just show you some very, very new data. This is not yet published. What we're looking at here is a part of the brain called the ventral striatum. The ventral striatum has been implicated in reward-related processes and motivation. And this is a particular part of the ventral striatum called the nucleus accumbens. And what we have observed is that the time course of accumbens activation that you can measure with functional MRI is highly predictive of positive affect and actually changes over time in patients with depression who are treated successfully and predicts improvements in positive affect. And that's what this figure is showing. It's actually showing patients with major depression who are treated and who show a change in the sustained activation of the accumbens over time in response to positive stimuli. And what we find is that the more a depressed person shows this increase in sustained accumbens activation, the more positive affect they report. And we also find that it is specifically an interaction between an area within the prefrontal cortex. This is the middle frontal gyrus and the nucleus accumbens. When you actually look at connectivity in the brain, that may be particularly responsible for this increase in positive affect that these depressed patients are showing. So this is just beginning to identify the neural circuitry that may underlie this outlook style. And in other work with non-clinical samples, we have found that this circuit importantly predicts individual differences in measures of well-being that are being used in large national samples in the US and other countries today. And these are studies that we're doing now where we're getting imaging measures in fairly large sample sizes with hundreds of participants on whom we have lots of other data of this sort. Okay, so I'm going to just skip that, but the kind of questions that are relevant to the outlook style are questions like, I believe the next 10 years will be better for me than the last 10. If a small but unexpected positive event happens to me in the morning, for example, having a great conversation with someone I did not previously know, the positive mood fades within minutes. So answering false to that question would be indicative of someone who has a more positive kind of outlook style. When I go to a party and I'm having a good time at the outset, the positive feeling tends to last for the entire evening. That's the flip side of that. I'm going to just skip that and move on to the social intuition style. This is a style, as I mentioned in my introduction, that has to do with the capacity to decode facial signs of emotion. And the research which first underscored the importance of this style was work that we did with autism. And among individuals with autism, what we did is we looked at their capacity to perform a very simple emotion discrimination task. And the task is schematically represented here. I won't go through all the details, but I'll tell you the key elements of it, which is simply on each trial, a child received a picture of a face, and the picture was either neutral or emotional. The picture could also be quarter turned like this or looking straight at the participant, and they received these facial stimuli while they're in the scanner. They simply indicated by pressing one of two buttons whether the face was emotional or neutral. Now, I want to just show you the study that we did. This was a study that was published. Our first study in this series was published in 2005. This is the first study that was done where objective eye tracking was actually used in the MRI scanner to determine where individuals with autism were actually looking when they were looking at faces. One of the questions which we were very bothered by is that there had been a lot of studies of the capacity of children with autism to decode other people's facial expression, but scientists had no idea where the children were actually looking when they were presented with faces in the scanner. And so we used infrared eye tracking that was embedded in a fiber optic goggle system to objectively determine where they were actually looking. So this is a typical scan path for a control participant, and what you see is that the participant is spending a lot of time focused around the eye region of the face. Now, I'll show you a classic scan path for a child with autism. They spend almost no time in the eye region of the face, and they scan mostly around the mouth region, or sometimes they scan just off the face itself. So we can use this information to determine objectively what the stimulus is that these children are actually seeing, and how that's related to brain function and structure. And I won't bore you with all the details, but this is just showing that kids with autism spend significantly less time looking at the eye region of the face. And it turns out that the volume of a person's amygdala, that is literally the size of the amygdala, is very strongly related to performance on this task, as well as to other features of the social behavior of these individuals. And let me just explain what's on this figure. If you look at the scatter plot on the right, those are the children with autism, and what it displays is amygdala volume on the x-axis, on the abscissa, and on the y-axis is displayed the reaction time in performing this face discrimination task. So higher numbers mean that they perform more slowly. And what you can see is that among the children with autism, those individuals who have the smaller amygdala volume, the amygdala volume that is on the left-hand side of these figures, are the ones who are taking much, much longer to perform the task. They are finding the task presumably to be more difficult. The controls show a modest association going in the other direction. It actually predicts not just their reaction time, but it actually predicts their gaze patterns so that children with autism who have the smaller amygdalae also are spending less time on the eye region of the face. And it turns out that kids with smaller amygdala volume are reported to be more socially impaired on clinical interviews, rigorous clinical interviews that are done early in life with the parents. So there's a whole corpus of evidence which implicates the amygdala as part of the circuitry for social intuition and underscores the importance of differences among individuals in this process. And from this, we've actually developed an understanding, a better understanding of both atypical as well as typical development of the amygdala, where the high socially impaired individuals, who are the ones in red, who would be represented by autistic children with the most severe manifestations, show early amygdala hypertrophy. Their amygdala volume is greater early in life, and then there's a much more rapid drop-off in amygdala volume that we think may be associated with excited toxic processes due to an overactive amygdala. That may be very technical for some of you. I'd be happy to answer questions about that later, but I'm going to just move on in the interest of time. So I want to just very briefly talk about the attention style and then move on to, in the latter few minutes of my talk, show how these styles can be transformed through contemplative practices and other kinds of mental strategies. So this is one of my favorite quotes from the chapter on attention in William James's Principles of Psychology. And he said in this chapter, the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. Now, the italics were actually in the original, and James ended this passage by saying, it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical directions for bringing it about. And I think had William James had more contact with the contemplative traditions, he would have seen that at least some of these provide a technology, a toolkit, if you will, for cultivating more refined attention. So we can do a little experiment here together. So if you just sit up straight and pay attention and look at this cross, and I'm going to show you a series of letters and numbers, and I want you to pay particular attention to the numbers. Okay, was the number 1 presented? How many people thought the number 1 was presented? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, you're all very, very attentive. That's great. Now, one of the limitations of PowerPoint is that you cannot precisely time stimulus presentation, so this is not like a lab experiment. The way we show this in the lab is actually the timing is a little bit different in important ways. But what I actually showed you was this sequence where there were a series of letters, and then you saw first the number 3, and that was followed roughly 500 milliseconds later by the number 7. There were a couple of letters that came between them, and those were the 2 numbers that I showed you. Now, I would say that the vast majority of you got the number 3, and I'd say about 70% of you got the number 7. And it turns out that if you do this on multiple trials with lots and lots of people, the majority of people will get the first number, and you get the second number about 60% of the time, on average. So you actually all, I would say, did better than average. But, you know, we didn't present it under optimal conditions. So now it turns out that, and now I'm segueing into a theme that I will talk about in a few moments more explicitly. This is a study that we published a few years ago where we looked at the effects of intensive meditation practice over 3 months on the ability to pay attention in this way that can be assessed with the attentional blink. And if you look at practitioners and controls here, the light gray bars are time 1 before the 3 months of practice. And you can see, not surprisingly, that the practitioners and the controls are performing about the same. But after the 3 months of training, the practitioners who are doing a form of mindfulness meditation are showing significantly greater accuracy on this measure of attentional blink compared to the controls. And we also measured brain activity. I don't have the slide here. And we found corresponding changes in brain activity that were associated with and predicted how well a person performed on this attentional blink task. I've already given you this message, but I just want to use this as an opportunity to underscore the fact that this is a very propitious time in the development of this science, because probably the greatest insights from modern neuroscience from the last decade have been insights related to neuroplasticity. So even though each of these 6 styles that I described very briefly are stable within adults, that is, if I took a person and tested them today and then brought them in 2 months later, their patterns would be roughly comparable. That does not mean that these styles cannot be transformed in ways that are beneficial, in ways that can be used to promote well-being. And I want to spend just a minute underscoring why this is so important. This is a paper which was published by a group from Duke University, and it came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences very recently, about a year ago. And I want to just show you, let's see, do I have the abstract? Okay. This was a study that was done that followed a cohort of 1,000 people. And the cohort was first identified when the mothers were in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, and they've been followed now until they're age 32 years of age. This is a cohort from Dunedin, New Zealand. And this particular article is looking at a metric or a construct that the investigators call self-control. And it relates to many of the issues that we've been talking about. It relates to the capacity to regulate attention. It relates to the capacity to regulate emotion. And what they observe, what they're looking at, is the relation between these metrics of self-control in early childhood and outcome at age 32 years of age. And what you see here, if you look on the left, childhood self-control is on the x-axis, and on the y-axis are a series of adult outcomes. And the ones on the left side of the figure include an index of physical health, substance dependence, and informant-rated substance dependence. So it's a more objective measure of substance use and abuse. And what you can see is that those kids who, when they were young kids, had high levels of self-control, who are on the high end of self-control, as young adults, age 32, they are showing very low levels of substance use. On the right-hand figure, the outcome measures include socioeconomic status, financial planfulness, actual income, financial struggles, and informant-rated financial problems. That's the one in purple. And what you can see again is that as kids, when the kids have high levels of self-control, they end up as adults being more financially robust and successful. And finally, this is adult criminal convictions in this cohort. And what you can see is that those kids who, as kids, had high levels of self-control had many fewer adult criminal convictions. This is the abstract of their paper, and they end the abstract by saying, interventions addressing self-control might reduce a panoply of societal costs save taxpayers' money, and promote prosperity. I think this is a very important article, and it should be a catalyst for us to use the best strategies available to promote these kinds of skills in young children, because the payoff is going to be enormous. So, a little brief autobiographical interlude. I'm a psychologist and a neuroscientist by training. And I've had a long-standing interest in meditation to sort of come out of the closet. Actually, after my second year of graduate school at Harvard, I went off to India. The faculty at Harvard thought I was going off the deep end. This was in the 1970s. I came back and I had a really fervent aspiration to do research in this area, but it was very clear to me that the times weren't right, the zeitgeist was not right, and it was made very clear that if I wanted a successful career in science, doing research on meditation was not a very good way for me to begin that career. So I then pursued the work that I've shown you today on the brain and emotion, which I still very much do today, but now it has come full circle. And in 1992, I had the great honor and opportunity to meet for the first time His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And at that meeting, His Holiness challenged me, and he said, look, you guys are using modern tools of neuroscience to investigate qualities like fear and anxiety and depression. Why can't you use those same tools to investigate qualities like kindness and compassion? And there really is no good answer for that other than the fact that it's hard. But when we began to study anxiety and fear, it was also hard. And so I made a commitment to His Holiness on that day in 1992 that I was going to do everything I could to put compassion on the scientific map. And I've been very gratified to see the activity that has occurred, particularly over the last several years, across laboratories in both North America as well as in Europe that are focusing on this topic and taking this challenge seriously. So this is just a picture of His Holiness when he first came to my lab in 2001, which was his first visit. He's been there since then. But this was a time we had the opportunity to show him the MRI scanner and spent a wonderful day in the lab together. I'm going to just skip this in the interest of time since I've talked about attention. I want to now transition to talk about nourishing kindness and to tell you about a study that is a very new study. It's not yet published. From our lab, where we ask the question whether we can see changes in the brain as well as in behavior with very short-term interventions that are designed to cultivate kindness and compassion. And so we asked whether this can be done in a period as short as 2 weeks' time. And so we did this in the context of a rigorous randomized controlled design. People signed up for a study where they were told that they would be assigned to one of two interventions, both of which are designed to promote well-being. One intervention was a compassion meditation intervention that I'll tell you about in a minute. The second intervention came from cognitive therapy, which is probably the most empirically well-validated treatment, psychological treatment for mood disorders and other and some anxiety disorders. So they got this 2-week intervention. We delivered the intervention for 30 minutes a day over the internet. So there are obvious advantages of doing this and there are obvious disadvantages. We could talk about that later. But one of the experimental advantages is we can tell how much time people are actually logged on to our protected website where they receive this training. And so from an experimental design perspective, it had certain virtues. As I mentioned, the comparison group was taught cognitive a kind of cognitive reappraisal from cognitive therapy. The elements of the compassion training, for those of you who might not be familiar with this kind of practice, people are asked to contemplate and visualize the suffering and then wishing the freedom from that suffering for different categories of people. And we first began with a loved one, a family member or a very close friend, someone that they knew very, very well, and imagine a time in their life when they may have been suffering, and then cultivate the strong aspiration that they be relieved from that suffering. They then moved on to themselves. From there, we had them move on to a stranger, and by a stranger, we mean here someone whose face you recognize, someone who is easy to visualize. It may be someone who works in the same building that you work in. It may be someone who's in a class that you're in, that you see on a regular basis, but you don't know much about their life. Could be a bus driver, anyone who you see on a regular basis. And envision a time in their life when they may have been suffering, and then cultivate the wish that they be free of that suffering. We then move on to a difficult person, someone who really pushes your buttons. Bring them into your mind and your heart, and envision a time in their life when they may have been suffering, and cultivate the aspiration that they be relieved from that suffering. And then we move on to all beings. They use phrases to do this that they mentally repeat to themselves silently, such as, may you be free from suffering, may you experience joy and ease. And they're instructed to notice whatever visceral sensations may be associated with this, particularly around the area of the heart. And they're instructed to feel the compassion emotionally and not to simply repeat the phrases cognitively. The basic study design is it's a randomized control design. They get randomized to either the compassion group or the reappraisal group. They get an MRI scan before they begin. They then go through 2 weeks of training. They get a second MRI scan at the end. We also administer a series of economic decision-making tasks that provide a behavioral measure of altruism. Since I'm in Vancouver, I wanted to just remind all of you that you have local experts here. This is a paper of Adele Diamond's, a review paper that she published last year, and she summarized this by saying diverse activities have been shown to improve children's executive function, including computerized training, non-computerized games, aerobics, martial arts, yoga, mindfulness, and school curricula. So there's a growing corpus of evidence, although I think it's fair to say at this point in time, it's not a very large corpus. So for those who want to learn more about it, I encourage you to poke around our website at the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds. These are the folks that actually do all the work. These days I'm more like an orchestra conductor and just try to stay out of their talented ways. And I'd be happy to answer questions.